the test, you hypocrites. Show me the coin used for the tax." And they brought him a denarius. And he said to them, "Whose head is this, and whose title?" They answered, "The emperor's." Then he said to them, "Give therefore to the emperor the things that are the emperor's, and to God the things that are God's." When they heard this, they were amazed, and they left him and went away. The word of the Lord. So this lectionary reading today from the Gospel of Matthew has to do with taxes. It's a dangerous thing to allow an economist in the pulpit when the topic is taxes. But perhaps by divine intervention, Catalyst is here this week. So to give them some time to play, I will need to keep it short. It's probably a good thing that I don't have a chalkboard up here too, because I would probably fill it up with graphs and equations. You may remember that last week's lectionary reading in Matthew was about the king's wedding feast and guests who refused an invitation to attend. Jesus was in part giving a warning to the Jewish leaders of the time. In this week's passage, those Jewish leaders launch a counterattack. They do this by asking Jesus questions which have been quite carefully crafted. They're trying to trap him. They even go so far as to ask these questions in public in an attempt to put Jesus on the spot with a question that's near impossible to answer. They wanted him to discredit himself with his own words in front of a large crowd of witnesses. Palestine at the time was occupied, and the Jews were subject to the rules of the Roman Empire. And given that setting, the Pharisees asked Jesus, "Is it okay or not? Is it lawful to pay tribute to Rome?" By tribute, they meant a type of tax. Now you can imagine how this question would attract the attention of the crowd. That tax, hey, yeah. Do we need to pay that or not? What's the deal? Do we really have to pay taxes to Caesar? Give our money to the people who invaded our land? Now, before we take a look at Jesus' answer, let's first take a look at the tax structure that the Palestinians were facing. There were 3 taxes that the Roman government put on them and regularly demanded. First, there was a ground tax. A person had to pay 1/10 of all the produce that came from the ground. So they had to pay this tax if it came from the land or the cash equivalent of it. So a farmer who grew grain knew that they'd have to pay 1/10 of all the grain they grew as this tax. Now, the farmers, as it turns out, must have had some good lobbyists back in Rome, because the wine and oil producers had to pay a 20% tax. Now, in addition to the ground tax was an income tax. And the income tax rate then was 1%. 1%. Those were the days. Third was a poll tax. This was a tax that had to be paid by every man aged 14 to 65. And the amount of the tax was 1 denarius, which was roughly the equivalent of 1 day's wages for a working man. The poll tax was also called a tribute. Now, last summer in my travels, I actually got to see a denarius. It was at the British Museum. They're small. They're smaller than a quarter. They're silver. These were in excellent condition. They were shiny. And sure enough, guess whose head was on the coin? It was Caesar. Yeah, it was pretty cool to see. Now, the British Museum's got a lot of stuff. They didn't just have one. They had like 15 of them. I think that's kind of the motto of the British Museum. If it's good enough to have, it's good enough to have 10 of them. And the joke was, how come the pyramids are in Egypt? It's because they don't fit in the British Museum. Well, in addition to those national taxes, there are also local taxes that had to be paid. These included import taxes, export taxes, duties on customs, taxes for using roads, taxes for crossing bridges, taxes for the right to own a farm animal, taxes to be able to drive a cart or a wagon, and taxes for entering into the harbor or a market. That's a lot of taxes. Those of us who have lived in California, or those of you who lived in New York, will say, well, that's getting off pretty light. But the tax that Jesus is being asked about here is the tribute tax. And the question poses a real dilemma for anyone trying to answer. If he said that it was unlawful to pay the tax, what would happen? He would quickly be reported to the Romans and arrested on charges of sedition. If he said it was lawful to pay the tax, he would be discredited in the eyes of the people who hated the Romans for charging it. Not only did the people resent the tax itself, they resented it even more for religious reasons. They believed that God was their only king. Their nation was a theocracy. The Pharisees were extremely orthodox and resented paying a tribute to Caesar. To have to pay a tribute to an earthly king was to admit the validity of that king, and therefore was an insult to God. Many of the more fanatical citizens insisted that any tax paid to a foreign king was just plain wrong. Facing this, no matter which way Jesus answered the question, he was likely to open himself up to big trouble. This question of paying taxes is not merely of historic interest. Matthew's gospel was written between 80 and 90 AD. The temple had been destroyed in about 70 AD. As long as the temple stood, every Jew had been obligated to pay a temple tax. After the temple was destroyed, the Roman government demanded that this temple tax still had to be paid, except that money was used for a temple in Rome to the god of Jupiter. It's obvious how hard that regulation was to swallow for those folks in Palestine. So this matter of taxes was a very real problem in the early days of the church. But getting back to Jesus, he was wise. He asked somebody, hand me a denarius, the coin that would be used to pay that tribute tax. The coin stamped with the image of the emperor on it. Whose face was on the coin? That's how you could tell who had power back then. As soon as a new emperor was ascended to the throne, all the old coins would be collected and melted, and a new coin would be struck with the face of the new emperor on there. So technically, the coin was ultimately the property of the king whose name was on it. So Jesus asks, whose image is on this coin? The answer was, it's Caesar's. He said, well then, give it back to Caesar. And give to God what belongs to God. His unique wisdom is timeless. He doesn't lay down laws and rules and regulations. He lays down principles. And here he lays down a very important one. Every Christian has a dual citizenship. We're citizens of the country in which we happen to live. And to that country, we have an obligation. We owe things. We owe our safety, which only a stable government can provide. We owe all the public services, from the street lights to a water system to trash pickup, education, medical services, provisions for the elderly and maybe the unemployed. This places us under a debt of obligation. And because we are Christians, we are to be responsible citizens and people of honor. Failure in good citizenship is also a failure of our Christian duty. Disorder and trouble can descend upon a country when Christians refuse to be leaders and leave it to the selfish, the self-centered, the self-seeking. The Christian has a duty to Caesar, and in return for the privileges which the rule of Caesar brings. But Christians are also a citizen of heaven. And there are matters where the responsibility of the Christian is to God. It may be that these two citizenships never clash. In an ideal world, they never would. But when the Christian is convinced that it is God's will that something should be done, or if he or she is convinced that something is being done against the will of God, they must resist and take no part in it. Where that boundary lies between the two citizenships, Jesus does not say. That's for our own conscience to determine, for the Holy Spirit's leading to guide us. There is, though, in this principle, in this passage, the principle which Jesus delivers. And that is to be, at the same time, a good citizen of your country and a good citizen of the kingdom of heaven. And not fail in our duty to either God or to country. While remembering, as Peter said, honor the emperor, but fear God. In this age of polarizing political opinion and expressions of national pride, may we remember that we are dual citizens with obligations to both heaven and earth, and that in fulfilling those obligations, may we be unified in our love for one another. In the name of the Father, and the Son,